some of the previous one we had on Korea and also on Korea. And what else did you have, Moises? It was Korea, Asia,
Korea, Taiwan.
Yeah, so we'll be trying to push, a more comparative, perspective, especially, particularly, this year with Asia, and hopefully next year we start a different cycle, perhaps focus more on Europe and other parts of the world. So we're really excited about having you to talk to us, because I think, as I said, there's not much semiconductor activity in Brazil or Latin America, except for Costa Rica, factories there with Intel. But I think this general framework and the upgrading issue is very critical for the current debates on developmentalism in Brazil, which I think you take a very strong view at least in your book. I don't know if your views have evolved, but I think it was very interesting, the views you had on developmentalism, which I think is a good corrective, for some of the overstrong debates you have in Brazil about developmentalism. As you know, Brazil being one of the birthplaces of that literature in many ways.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm happy to present. So thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry it's been a long semester. I find teaching online to be very dissatisfying. So
it is exhausting,
Yeah, it's much harder to engage the students, and they have me sort of on a treadmill over the past 5 terms. I've had to teach 6 new courses. So yeah, so it's so again, this term I had to teach a new course.
Why are you teaching new courses all the time? It's just
well, that's a good question. I mean, I think some of it is bad luck, or some. I mean, one course they really should not have given me. They knew they were going to cancel it, and they had me teach it. And it was going to be, not only was it a new course for me, but it was about international relations, which is really not my area of expertise. So it was even more work for me than it. They should have had someone who had taught it before just teach it, because I mean, I borrowed my colleague's syllabus and just sort of.
Of course, but I mean, you're not familiar with the literature, so I'm sure you can deliver, but not as good as someone who comes from IR.
Right, so that was probably the worst one. And then, of course, I got very good evaluations for last term on India's political economy. Was one of our electives, and they've decided to cut back on electives. So I don't know if I'll ever be able to teach it again. And again, I'm not a scholar of India, but I needed to teach they needed a new elective, so I taught this course. Frankly, I was a little bit nervous teaching about China. So I said, okay, teaching about India's domestic political economy won't get me in trouble with the national security law here.
Safe harbor.
But then they said, well, yeah, we're not going to have, they're basically not offering many elective. I mean, we've also lost faculty members. Other things have happened, but it's all around. It keeps being I mean, next year in theory, I have to teach another new class, but they were nice to me. They were kind of like.
So I'll suggest your department head so you teach a course on Brazilian political economy. Now you took India, and then you can become a collaborator of the paper me and Moises write on Brazil and India.
I think I will just if I have to do that, then I will have to rope you two in and just invite a bunch of guest speakers from Brazil too.
Oh, we'd love to collaborate. It was as we're writing, we're starting to write, we started, but we're still somewhat not stuck, but we just got caught up in other activities, on a comparative study of Brazil and India, strategies, for advancing into the knowledge society, and looking at both the software and the pharmaceutical industry in Brazil and India, which are somewhat comparable sectors in terms of high tech, and which both countries have some advancements, and so we try to still trying to figure out how to tackle and get data on both industries which are relevant. So eventually we'll chop it off to you to give you some comments once you have a more structured piece. And still very rough.
That'll
You're
be
not
great.
going to impede that on you so far.
India is going through an interesting moment now with Modi's reforms, and it seems that it's shaken up the political landscape. And
for good or for ill.
yeah, for good or for ill, I'd say that.
You can argue it either way.
Or for real, yeah.
Let me just get something here.
Just let me check if we have. We are broadcasting this through YouTube, and then it will be available.
Okay.
Yeah, and kind of widely advertised, in both sort of the technical community. I mean, there's some technical semiconductor, people who are still like trying to build semiconductors in Brazil. So, and I've done a lot of work with these people in the past. So there's some like technical policymakers. I don't know if they're coming to attend, as well as political economists and economists, who kind of lead, a lot of the debate about development in Brazil. More orthodox and heterodox economists, as well as people in general who might be interested in China, like China Brazilian Business Council and Council for International Relations of Brazil, which has a lot of concerns about China because of the relationship between Brazil and China. So eventually, I don't know who's going to show up, but eventually might have some let's say left field questions from IR people, but since you're already familiar with the IR people,
not really.
well prepared for those IR people. They have sometimes they have a warped mind, But anyway, so and then there might be some also technical questions from people from the industry itself. I don't know who's going to show up, but we advertise widely.
Yeah, and well, there are people who told me they'll be coming. Bruno, Cristiano, yeah. They're both getting in.
Hi, Cristiano.
Hi, Cristiano.
Cristiano is one of the leaders of the comparative political economy group we have. He's at the Federal University of Fluminense next to Rio de Janeiro. And Bruno is a colleague from Mexico.
Yeah, he's a colleague from also working with this topic.
You have also already there Rocky, who's a student of Moises, who's doing a PhD on South Korean development, on the Pakchung, doing a comparative study of dictatorships in Brazil and in South Korea.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because Brazil and South Korea have dictatorships during the same period, but of course
the outcome's entirely different. Yeah.
Right.
So trying to make sense of that. Very interesting. So let's give us a couple of minutes. I don't know what's your call. Let's wait until 9:05.
Well, I think that. Let me see. I think we could start because now it's already. We have 9 participants here, and
9:01 for me. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe 4 minutes. Yeah, maybe 4 minutes more. And you can start at 9:05.
So what's your teaching load there, Douglas, so far? I mean, right now, you have 2 courses per semester?
Yes, it's a 2-2. So that's perfectly reasonable. Yeah. It was just the lack of repeats that's sort of been challenging.
These are undergraduate courses. Do you have like a graduate seminar too?
Well, the whole gamut. So we have both a lot of undergraduate and master's students courses, and just last school year, we started to have formal seminars for our PhD students. Okay. So I do teach one of those, or I teach I teach the comparative political economy half of the comparative politics field seminar.
Okay. We have here a colleague, you might see his picture there, also MIT Mafia there, Renato Lima, who is a recent PhD graduate, who now teaches at the Asian School of Business in Kuala Lumpur. His brand new campus in the background there. It's just showing off, you know, the ASB campus now, just to make us envious.
Hi, Douglas. It's a great pleasure to see your talk.
Hi. Thank you.
I'm a course 17 graduate from
Right.
So he's a fellow Asian. He's based in Malaysia. So such a base at some point. We have a project on the offshore industry in Asia, and out in some other colleagues.
It would be lovely to visit you in Hong Kong once borders reopen.
Right, right. Likewise, I'm supposed to go to Malaysia at some point, but right now we still have 21-day hotel quarantine if we leave Hong Kong. So I'm not leaving Hong Kong.
I mean, upon return, you have to be on quarantine for 21 days. So
Yes.
Oh,
that's stringent.
Yes. Yeah. It used to be much less stringent. It used to be 14 days and you could do it at home.
Oh.
But because it was less stringent, there were some violations and people didn't think it was long enough. They traced some outbreaks to people coming back who were asymptomatic or whatever. So it's become more stringent. I've actually completed all of my vaccinations. So I'm hoping they become less stringent on the vaccinated, but who knows?
But now upon return, you have to go to assigned hotels by the government and they monitor in these hotels or what?
Yes, you just basically are stuck in the hotel room for 21 days.
Okay. Oof.
So, and hotel rooms in Hong Kong can be pretty small.
That's what I'm about to say, especially in Hong Kong. Yeah, it feels like a prison or worse.
Yeah, these Spanish friends of ours, they were in a hotel on sort of in central downtown Hong Kong where there's very tall buildings, and so they only got sunlight for about 15 minutes every day because the tall buildings were blocking it. So they had to rotate each family member to stand in front of the window for X number of minutes to get a little bit of sunlight each day.
Wow. Okay, Moisés, shall we kick it off? Moisés, you're on mute.
Yeah, I think we can.
Okay. I'll just make a brief introduction.
Set the ball rolling.
And then we get the ball rolling. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Antônio Botelho. I'm a professor at Universidade Cândido Mendes in Rio de Janeiro. And we have here, I think it's the 5th edition of this seminars on comparative political economy with the focus on Asia. Now I think this is the 51 of the series. And it's a great pleasure to have Douglas Fuller now speaking to us today. Douglas is an old friend and part of the MIT Mafia, who's been studying development from different perspectives and over the several decades. We have other colleagues here. Renato is also part of this Mafia. Anyway, Douglas is currently a professor at the City University of Hong Kong in Hong Kong, China. He has taught previously at Zhejiang University, if I totally massacred the name, but also at King's College and American University previously. And he's, undoubtedly the leading specialist on the semiconductor industry nowadays, particularly in China. And he also has very, I would say, very interesting and very revolutionary views about, what led, to China's development, which I think is, which become very provocative, in the debates we're going to follow up here. And so, he's been writing about the semiconductor industry in China for several years. And as I'm not going to recite all the papers, but in the poster, for the advertising for this webinar, we put out his latest book, So which is it's a fascinating book, even for those who don't know much about the technology. Douglas is a very clear prose, and I was totally astonished, by the amount of information I was able to process in a clear way in that book. I mean, going through 500 interviews. I couldn't even start thinking about how I will do that, but Douglas did very skillfully in that book. And so it's my great pleasure now to have Douglas Fuller talking to us about the limits of China.
Okay, so thank you.
Okay, Douglas, you have the floor. If everyone can shut off the microphones and the images, so
Okay.
and just look at Douglas in the presentation. Thank you, Douglas, again. Looking forward to it.
So, thank you, Antonio and Moises, for the invitation. I wish I could come to Rio to present in person, but maybe there will be some post-COVID times when that can happen. So a lot of my slides will be much more just the facts, about the industry development, but I will throw in a few slides that are more the provocations of how I explain the somewhat accidental route of development in China. And then in the Q&A, we can return to that. So there's a lot of sort of just empirical development I'm going to get through. First, the policies from 1990 to 2013, and then this 2014 until today mega project, and briefly talk about the prospects of the industry going forward. So very simply, if we think about the integrated circuit value chain, or semiconductors colloquially, there are essentially three big blocks. There's of activities. There's the design, where you use software to create the code, and then you transfer that to the fabricators, the people who take that code and use it to imprint circuitry onto different types of materials, principally silicon. And then those printed wafers are transferred to the assembly and test phase, that's A&T here, where they package the individual ICs, the individual chips, in different types of packaging material so they can connect to other components, and then they test them. Generally speaking, the technology intensive sectors are design and fabrication. And then on top of this, I have the EDA tools in one box and capital equipment, because those are the really important inputs that aren't part of this whole chip design flow, but feed into it. So the EDA tools are these software tools used to design the chips. But as you notice here, I have this dark black line between the EDA box and the fabrication to indicate that the EDA tool vendors have to work closely with the people manufacturing the chips, the fabricators, in order to ease the design for manufacturing. And then you have also the critical capital equipment, the machine tools that go into both the fabrication and assembling and test phases. Just so when I refer to these later on, you'll know what I'm talking about. So back in the 1990s, China was still a relatively poor country, but for both developmental and national security concerns, it wanted to develop its integrated circuit industry. And it first had this 908 project starting in 1990, where they chose this state-owned enterprise, originally the state essentially research lab that they created a firm called Huajing out of. And the idea was that they would get technology transfer from firms such as Lucent, the former American telecommunications firm, to build up their own integrated device manufacturer, a firm that both designed and fabricated its own chips. They also tried to start to spread computer-aided design, these sort of early EDA-like tools, to SOEs. Unfortunately, this 908 project was pretty much a disaster. That took almost 8 years for the fab to be completed, and then they didn't really, fab means the fabrication facility, and then they didn't really have any designs of their own to use for this fabrication facility. So then they decided just to rent it out to this Taiwanese-backed firm, CSMC, and eventually sold the fab site to this CSMC JV firm that was controlled by the CSMC. So this purported national champion at the very end ended up in the hands of a Taiwanese-backed firm. Following on that, there was the 909 project. So this was during the 9th five-year plan. That's why it's 909. The other one was in the 8th five-year plan. And so here, the lesson they learned from the 908 was, okay, we can't really do it ourselves. We need a formal joint venture, JV, with a firm. They decided to create a JV with Japan's NEC and created this Chinese firm, Hua Hong. So they had Hua Hong NEC. And they also encouraged many state-owned firms to enter the IC design industry. This firm didn't work out very well either. There were very heavy losses of almost $6 billion in the first years of Hua Hong NEC's production, which is quite remarkable given the low levels of revenue and output of the firm. And up until 2005, it was extremely dependent on Japanese technology and Japanese technologists based in Japan. If you wanted to actually make sure that your chip could be produced there, you tended to have to go and engage with Japanese engineers in Japan because they were trying to keep control of the technology. And what kept the fab up and running was basically state procurement, such as smart cards, IC cards from the Chinese state. So it wasn't a very commercial facing venture. So the state-owned operations did not do very well, but the firms that really pushed forward China's development in ICs were these, what I would call hybrid firms. So they were typically foreign registered firms with foreign investment that were based in China, but outside of the Chinese financing system. And they tended to be also founded by ethnic Chinese, either returning mainlanders or Taiwanese or a mix, Taiwanese, Hong Kongers, and mainlanders. But the first of these firms was this CSMC that sort of helped them catch up a little bit to just 10 years behind the frontier instead of 19 years behind. And then more importantly, this firm SMIC came along in the early 2000s. And by 2003 was sort of a fast follower of the leading edge foundries such as TSMC with only 1 or 2 years behind and maintained that pace up until the 2010s. Now, state policy did play a role to some degree. There were tax incentives to encourage both investment in capital equipment and to try to encourage design operations in China. So the first big set of these nationwide promotional policies was the number 18 document that came out in 2000. And then that was followed up and extended and made even more generous in a way with the number 4 documents that covered the 2011 to 2020 period. But there was also a fair amount of learning during this time. When they put out the number 418 document, they had some explicit policies that were pretty much in black and white violation of WTO rules. So they promised this VAT break for firms that were going to do design in China. This ran afoul of the trade-related investment measures because you had to do all of the design work in China. The US government, at the behest of the Semiconductor Industry Association of the United States, took China to WTO court. China then just settled, basically said, okay, we're going to drop that part of these policies. But what China cleverly did is have many more sort of informal policies in terms of providing funds where you wouldn't necessarily find a paperwork stream that would point to a lot of state subsidization and thus running afoul of certain international agreements. However, I think, as with a fair number of other Chinese industrial policies, this industrial policy was somewhat problematic. And just quickly to go through sort of the general problems faced in China. One is the system of fragmented authoritarianism. Some people try to sell this as, oh, the local governments know best, so let them do whatever they want to do. But the problem is it's very hard to really have effective coordination when you let local governments do whatever they want to do. So the center doesn't necessarily know what's going on at the local levels. There's a lot of incomplete information, very incomplete information. And that's even made worse by just the sheer geographic and population size of China. It is a huge country. It's quite hard to keep track of everything going on across the 18,000 plus counties in China, for example. Another issue is that in contrast to the past developers of Northeast Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, that were very export oriented, China is this large continental sized country, has overall not been as export-oriented as these previous developers. And some would argue that has been problematic because it was the sheer importance of the exports that allowed governments to really judge which firms were doing well. Oh, that firm's exporting more, so they must be doing well, because you couldn't really game exports. In China, a lot of industrial policy has been driven instead by state procurement, which is the exact opposite problem. Okay, this firm's selling more to the state, but that's because the state decided that it liked this firm. So you don't really know if this is a proper way to judge performance. There's also been very skewed capital allocation, very much favoring state-owned enterprises, especially central government-owned state-owned enterprises. And there's been these political incentives to sort of open up to foreign investment. On the one hand, those have been quite good in encouraging foreign investment and alternatives to the state-owned enterprises. On the other hand, local governments in China have been quite investment-centric and not really too concerned about the quality of the investments. This is particularly true because of the short tenure of local leaders in China. And so then you end up with often sort of tremendous waste. The former Minister of Science and Technology in 2013 estimated that the ministry could only account for 40% of how 40% of its research money was spent. Now, so between the obstacles of favoring state-owned enterprises and the fact that state-owned enterprises tend to be relatively slow-moving because they have the benefits of state procurement and relying on the state, how did China manage to grow in this fast-moving area of integrated circuits? And I would argue it's these hybrid firms, again, these foreign-invested firms using overseas capital and ethnic Chinese management, who sort of solve the problem of the soft budget constraints that hinder the state-owned enterprises, but also were much more committed to placing core firm resources in China than your typical MNC. Nominally, they were foreign enterprises. Nominally, they were some sort of multinational enterprise. But if you looked at them closely, functionally, they were headquartered in China, and their sort of operational strategy was to compete by utilizing resources in China. So through these policies during the first decade of the 21st century, the number 18 and number 4 policies, China did increase a lot its fabrication capacity. So it went from 1.5% of worldwide capacity in 2001 to 12.7% in 2015. Now, there should be some caveats here. This may include capacity that was relatively, was not used very often. This doesn't necessarily, I think, take into account the various process nodes, like essentially how many integrated circuits could be on each wafer, even though it takes account of the wafer size. So it may slightly exaggerate China's actual productive capacity, but nevertheless, it grew quite rapidly during this time. However, the most sustainable firms were these hybrid firms and then some multinational firms. So this firm SMIC I mentioned had fabs not just in Shanghai, but Tianjin, Beijing, Shenzhen, Chengdu, Wuhan. Though some of these have been spun off over time as it's sort of restructured. The Taiwanese firm UMC started in Suzhou. During this time, TSMC started a fab in Shanghai. SK Hynix, the Korean firm, started large fabs in Wuxi. Intel, of course, was in Dalian. They've now sold that fab to Hynix. And Samsung, by 2015, had opened its fab in Xi'an. However, considering all of this, so all of those should be considered relatively positive developments for the fabrication space in China. But during this decade, there was a tremendous amount of wasted investments. People told me how they would basically go around China shopping for equipment that had never been used, because enterprising local governments would decide, hey, let's build a fab, and once we build it, somebody will come and run it for us. Well, that was somewhat unrealistic, particularly when all these other local governments are trying to do the same thing. But some of the time, they couldn't even sell this equipment to anyone, because by the time prospective buyers came to look at the equipment, it hadn't been taken care of. It wasn't in a proper clean room. It kind of had rusted away. And so billions of dollars have been wasted. Sorry, here we go. There was a similar surge in China's IC design industry. Again, behind this, there were these tax incentives of the government. There were also these design centers set up by the government, 7 national design bases set up by the government. But if you look at it closely, most of the successful firms tended not to ever bother to use those national design centers. Basically, they had enough of their own funding to acquire EDA tools on their own. Some of them were suspicious that these design centers would be it would be too easy for their own designs to leak to other firms. So some of the main policy thrusts of the government don't seem to have been very efficacious. And once again, a lot of the most successful firms were these hybrid firms, particularly commercial-facing firms. So if you look at firms like Spreadrum, RDA, Galaxy Core, they were all trying to sell out into the marketplace. Now, it's true both with fabrication and with design. There were local governments trying to throw money at these firms to encourage firms to come to China. But there is a sharp contrast here between the state-owned firms who were very much focused on state procurement, that's in red, and the private firms or the hybrid firms that were very much focused on the commercial marketplace. Now, one thing that was of great concern of China over time was that the chip deficit China was running was quite high. China, of course, had already been a major assembler of electronics, and that just kept growing. And with this export platform, its integrated circuit trade deficit outpaced its trade deficit in crude oil. However, we have to remember that a fair number of these chips that were supposedly contributing to this deficit were then re-exported afterwards. Here we can see China. So if we look at where a device is assembled, China is 35% of all the market, but local end users, only 24% of the market. So 11% of, there's 11% difference, or basically a third of the difference, almost a third of the difference between the assembly and what remains in China. Right, I'm sure the oil shock had some degree of effect on this as well. But even before that, people in China were already complaining about the chip deficit. So it was a nice way for them to drive it home further that the chips were still running at about 10% of overall imports and were perceived to be a problem. So despite the success in creating more fabrication capacity and the rise of chip design in China, the Chinese government was still very dissatisfied. And one of the decisions, one of the lessons it seemed to learn was, well, we simply hadn't done enough. We hadn't spent enough money in these previous waves of investment, which is actually somewhat questionable. I mean, a lot of money was spent, I think, because it was sort of diffuse. Some of it was spent by provincial governments and local governments. From the perspective of the people at the center, maybe they thought it was smaller than it actually was. And this icy trade deficit was really beginning to bother them. And, after 20 plus years of trying to upgrade, they felt they still hadn't sufficiently caught up. So the government announced this mega project. The headline figures, well, we want 1 to 1.24 trillion RMB in investment, but the central government itself had this big fund of 120 billion renminbi, with the initial split going to be 30% IC design, 40% fabrication, 30% assembly and test, roughly. But then after that, more emphasis was placed on fabrication. And the goal initially was to meet 70% of China's IC consumption by 2025. They're not going to get anywhere close to that. And later projects, such as Made in China 2025, sort of subsumed the mega project. And then there were additional policies sort of added on, like the Next Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan encouraged AI-related chips. But so in 2019, they had the second tranche of this big fund come out, with, again, the idea that along with this central government fund of over, I think 126 billion was eventually what they came up with, there would be funds from banks, from regional and local governments to keep investing. Now, the problem with this plan was it was still focused heavily on a lot of these existing SOEs. So Datang, this telecommunications firm that has since been merged with this other telecommunications firm, this Wuhan firm originally called XMC, and Tsinghua Unigroup, which was this Tsinghua-related conglomerate that had no experience in the IC industry. So it was very clear they wanted to use state actors to conduct this policy. They created all these new investment vehicles, but these by and large were also beholden to, if not owned by, the Chinese state. And looking back now, it seems much more obvious that more and more obvious that Xi Jinping is really quite enamored of state ownership and, more importantly, state control. And this really shaped these policies. Here we just show estimates of subsidies, and on the right side is subsidies as a percent of current revenue. And of the top 5 firms here, 3 of them are Chinese. So you have SMIC, Huahong, and Tsinghua Unigroup, with the other 2 being ST Micro, a European firm, and Micron, an American firm. They are actually, most of its fabs are in East Asia, so I suspect a lot of these subsidies are coming from other governments, such as the Taiwanese government. Micron doesn't have any fabs in China. But this just goes to show that there was a pretty substantial push by what originally were relatively small players in China. If we look at it from this picture, China's also increased its overall consumption of fabrication equipment spending, not by a huge amount, but it has increased over its relative spending prior to this policy. But remember, prior to the policy, China was already pretty encouraging of investment in this industry. So this just encouraged more investment. And then through these investment vehicles, they tried to acquire a lot of firms. They did acquire a fair number of firms in assembly and testing and some fabless design firms. But I would argue a lot of it, particularly on the design side, was a little bit meaningless. So they overpaid to buy these firms that were listed on NASDAQ to bring them home to China, even though all these firms they bought were located, almost all of them were located in China. So they weren't bringing them home. So they overpaid for them. It didn't really change the activities of these firms. It did bring them under state ownership, which, given the state's track record, is a little bit worrisome. But as China kept buying more and more firms, there was more and more pushback. Of course, The US has had CFIUS since way back in the 1980s with friction with Japan. So we've had this investment vetting vehicle. Japan indicated they weren't going to allow them to take over Japanese firms. Tsinghua Unigroup was sounding out about what was then Toshiba's arm, now Kyosha. And of course, even and then Taiwan also said no. And there was the beginnings of new policies in Europe to both vet and potentially block these investments. So up to a point, this worked in inquiring of firms, but most of these firms were of relatively questionable value. What was much more worrisome is the government sort of began to encroach on these hybrid firms. So SMIC fell under state control. The funds from the big fund from the central government were used to buy shares. That's Sino-IC Capital. And essentially, the board was taken over by representatives of the state. And as I already mentioned, these fabulous firms that were listed offshore, but based in China, spread RDM and ties, were also bought out by the state. In the case of RDA, then their core management team rapidly all left. They had been against the buyout. It was good for investors, obviously, but they feared state ownership. So they actually left that firm. The tale of Montage seems a little bit better. As of recent reports, the same founders and top management team, the core team is still there at that firm, and they've relisted on the new star market in China. So Chinese revenue in the semiconductor industry, this also includes OSAT, or the assembly and test industry, has continued to rise, as has IC production. But Chinese IC production, by this estimate, is actually quite low. Chinese production owned by Chinese firms is still not high, because the earlier waves of investment encouraged a lot of investment by multinationals or hybrid firms. Those firms were a big part of the increase of fabrication. So the point of the policy, which it was to create Chinese domestic firms, in some sense, the past policies failed, and still it's relatively slow growing. So in foundries, you have two Chinese foundries, SMIC and Hua Hong. But Hua Hong's quite small. SMIC has sort of fallen further behind the leading firms such as TSMC. Then again, everyone's falling technically further behind TSMC. But if you look at their performance in terms of gross margins or net margins, they're not doing nearly as well as the overseas firms. And I can talk more in detail about SMIC and these other firms in the Q&A if people want me to. So there's been because of this encouragement of investment, there's been a whole slew of fabs planned. Once again, just like in the early 2000s, there's already reports of a lot of waste, of fabs, equipment being bought, but no one really in position to run it. Again, there are these incentive structures in place in China where local governments, for political merit, want to goose to pump up their investment numbers. Fabs are pretty expensive. They're a great way to do that. Plus, if you're the party secretary and you leave in a year, you don't care that much about what happens to the fab after you leave that jurisdiction. So there's a lot of short-term incentives for officials that lead to irrational investment into this, irrational from an industry's perspective, though from a political perspective for cadre advancement, for official advancement, are perfectly rational plans. Now, one thing that they did with the 2014 project that was probably smart is they put more emphasis on memory as opposed to these logic foundries. Memory are the storage chips. The reason why that is probably smart is those tend to be extremely capital intensive and very vertically integrated. So arguably they play more to the strengths that China has just in being willing to spend lots of money. Unfortunately, a lot of the human capital China has built up has been in logic foundries, and it's actually quite different from a lot of the skills you need for these memory fabs. So thus far, the memory fabs have been a little bit slow going for China, in that they have to pay a lot of expensive foreign engineers. I've been to a DRAM fab in the interior of China, went to their cafeteria, a bunch of tables of people who were clearly Taiwanese based on their accents, then a bunch of Koreans, some Japanese. And the executive who was there with me was like, oh, yeah, we need local Chinese, too expensive. But I think it's going to be a process that takes quite a bit of time for them. So I think it was feared overseas that they were going to immediately crash this market, but now given the human capital strains, that will be harder to do. And here are the list of various fabs, and then some of them are under contestation. There seems to be some political problems with Tsinghua Unigroup now. They defaulted on this overseas bond, which sounds maybe like there's some trouble at home. There was disputes over whether or not they should pursue yet another planned fab in another city, Chongqing. Readjustments are happening. This Fujian Jinhua is already dead. Inotron and YMTC are the top one and the very bottom are the two fabs that are going to be the most promising. So in terms of the IC design space, it's been a bit more promising. I mean, the downside was the takeover of these hybrid firms, but there's still some hybrid firms competing in this area. And by far the largest so-called fabless design firm is Huawei's own internal design operations, HiSilicon, which mainly just serves Huawei's own needs. Now, of course, because of the US export controls, this HiSilicon operation is under threat. And again, we can return to that in Q&A. But if we look at China's revenue in terms of global revenue, it is they're not really with the large firms. Some would place them in the top 10. So here you have HiSilicon and Unigroup. Of course, HiSilicon's not HiSilicon and Apple's there as well are not purely standalone design operations. And then Unigroup, that the design operations there might not be only including the fabless design operations they bought. And in any case, they're facing a lot of competition from firms like NTK. So going forward, I think it will be a little bit difficult for them. So overall, what are sort of the prospects in this industry? On the IC design side, China has been doing quite well. These smaller, sophisticated firms like Montage are still around. Firms like DJI stole a bunch of designers from Huawei. It's rumored. They certainly had a large design team. So those, they seem to be rising. Of course, DJI is now on the US entity list as well. But the Star Market has listed promised firms such as Montage and Bacon, which was another one of these firms that looked like it was going this hybrid route that was based in Shanghai, but now has listed locally. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the memory fabrication might be promising. The downside is they've had this huge misallocation of resources. They're continuing to be very pro state-owned enterprise, and they probably need to focus more money directly on human capital development. So some estimate they need 400,000 more skilled workers in this industry that they have sort of a shortfall of. And here just where China stands by some estimates in these various industries. So on that EDA and IP side, they're pretty small, and capital equipment small. Foundry not doing so badly. They're big in OSAT, which is assembly and test, which is typical. There's a lot of, it's labor intensive. There's a lot of it in the developing world. IC design, pretty respectable share. I mean, it's basically the big players are the US, Taiwan, and China. And then memory, they're just making a little bit of headway. Here's another way to look at it, just to wrap up. So China is this light blue space. So they have a little bit in this EDA and core memory. The big dark blue is the US. Taiwan is the orange. Korea is the lighter green. And then the darker green is Japan. And the black is Europe. And then there's other, which depending on the segment is different places. So what they call logic here captures. Here they're trying to split up the value made from design versus fabrication, which is a little bit hard to do when it's done internally. But here, China only has 5%, Taiwan is 7%, but these other players that Europe does okay at 8%, but China's not doing too badly. DAO is discretes and other things. So this is a weird category. It's a mix of high end and low end. So what you see in Europe and the US is relatively high-end analog components, but a lot of the low end would probably be in China. In memory, you see, according to this rating, China doesn't even show up. This is for 2019. The big one is Korea at 59%. Manufacturing equipment, it's basically the US and Japan with a tiny sliver for China, a little bit for Korea, and this 18% for Europe is basically the lithography maker, ASML. Materials is spread evenly. Wafer fabrication, the US is only down to 12%. Here, China is at 16%, but I think they're sort of, because they're separating out the designing part for firms that have internal operations. So this may sort of overvalue China's role in fabrication a bit. But you see China, Taiwan, and Korea are the two big players. Japan still has a lot of fabrication capacity. And then for assembly and test, China is huge. It's almost half. And if you look at the overall value chain, according to their estimates, China now has 9%, quite respectable. But Chinese would probably have had, but we're 24% of consumption. They would want more of that. So just to finish up, I mean, if you look here, you can see that there's been all these fears in not only in the US, but also elsewhere in Japan and Taiwan, Korea, Western Europe. I attended a meeting at the OECD in 2019 where this graph itself was from one of their reports where, like, you know, are semiconductors going to follow these other areas, particularly photovoltaic modules, solar panels, where China comes in and just destroys the market. You see here with operating margins of the leading company declining 83%. But that really hasn't happened in semiconductors. China's suppliers market share here, I think they're taking a very narrow view of Chinese suppliers, but it should be a little bit higher than that probably. But, you know, it's still very, very low. Real China-owned, China-based suppliers. And consequently, there's been an increase in the operating margins of leading firms in this industry rather than a decrease thus far. But unfortunately, China also hasn't really, despite the enormous funds spent, gotten quite as far as it had intended in this space. And in some ways, with its emphasis on state ownership, may be shooting itself in the foot. Okay, now ready for Q&A. That was a lot to digest, I realize.
Well, thank you very much, Douglas. I think it was we had a really good masterclass on the semiconductor industry, particularly in China, and a very clear one, you know, for us to make sense, you know, of this evolution of China in the context of the global, you know, semiconductor industry. And I think it was beautifully done by you. I mean, very clear and very structured, you know, which is a very complex industry. And I've been studying this industry also for 30 years. I'm always amazed, you know, how you're able to deliver, you know, such a good picture of it, and in particular its evolution in the problems of the issues, you know, related to China. Just to kick off the Q&A, you know, in fact, I sent you know some questions. I mean, I just gotta address some just to be able to kick it off, and then I think my questions in a way are part of partially comments, you know. So I just want to run through a couple of them. Just initially, you know, I mean, I think for Brazil, you know, Brazil, just to give you know, Brazil has no role in this industry, you know. But there's some echoes of some of the comments you made about the state-owned enterprise. You know, Brazil effort, the latest effort in semiconductors was exactly, you know, to develop a state-owned enterprise, which was dependent on public procurement. So there's some echoes of Chinese policy there. And also it miserably failed, you know, in the sense, you know, that a lot of equipment just set unused, you know, their lack of personnel. So there's some lessons that can be learned from the very small efforts of Brazil. And then there was some efforts also to build some large, you know, memory production with some shady, you know, Argentinian firm who did some assembly and testing, which also failed. You know, these are the most recent developments in terms of fabrication. And then in terms of IC design, you know, there's been a decade ago, there was a government program to promote IC design. And then you had, you know, the equivalent of state-owned enterprise, which are like university-based, and also sort of the Tsinghua group, you know, but of course not the same corporate level that Tsinghua Uni Group has. But the idea is that some universities, you know, could develop, you know, IC design companies, and of course, you know, most of them they're very project-oriented, you know, very little corporate orientation, and they probably miserably fail. You know, some might still be doing little bits and pieces here and there for local demand, you know. But in the end, you know, there are few spin-offs for university, you know, who really took a more international view, and I think you can count them in one hand. You know, I participated in the project, you know, back then, but I haven't totally kept up. And then I just recently talked to one of the entrepreneurs of one of those small IC design firms, you know, and they still seem to be doing okay because they really, I mean, they're looking for contracts abroad. You know, they have partnerships with other Asian, you know, IC design firms, so they're able to integrate into this value networks, you know. But of course, you know, and there's like a budding demand in Brazil because there's a consumer market which is evolving. Companies are modernizing, starting to develop, you know, their own ICs, you know, for modernize their product lines. Sometimes, of course, you know, that's the whole issue of the economic crisis in Brazil, the ongoing recession that kind of pulls down investment. But still, they are doing okay. I talked to this entrepreneur a few weeks ago. And they're still growing. They received, you know, 2 rounds of VC investment, so they're coming along basically. You know, they're not going to become any major stars, but they are holding the fort basically. Mm-hmm. But that's some of the very basic panorama of Brazil, which I think there's some echoes in when your beautiful story of China. Some of my comments, you know, has to do, you know, the main one has to do with let me just. Has to do, you know, with the high degree of specificity of the IC industry. Now, I mean, now thinking in more what lessons can we take from this experience of the industry with the hybrids and the argument that you have in the book that you kind of touched upon here, but you didn't really develop, you know, the issue of important institutions, you know, particularly, you know, foreign finance or VC, you know, as an upgrading tool elsewhere in any other industry. You know, just wonder if you could comment on that. I mean, in your view, there are other industries, you know, in which important institutions like the Chinese had, you know, could play a role, or this era has gone. I mean, let's say, especially the finance and import institution cannot play a role anymore. A question related to another point that you also touched upon is has to do the role of the military, spurring technological development in the IC industry in China. I mean, of course, the military played a role in the IC industry everywhere in the world in the early stages, especially in the US, but also in Europe. To what extent the military, you know, because you touch upon the state-owned enterprise, but do the military labs or military demand, you know, was able to advance, you know, perhaps some specific technologies or fabrications or designs, you know. I mean, do they have a role? Because we know that a lot of this state-owned enterprise, they're like they provide to dual markets, and I think it's part of the current, you know, trade wars or the strategic, you know, technological wars between the US and China, and sanctions, you know, probably going to be imposed, you know, on some of those companies. I mean, that's part of another question I'm coming up. A further question, also more broad, you know, in terms of political economy, you know, has to do in your book, you know, and you touched it upon also in your presentation, suggested the hybrids will be incorporated to China's domestic political economy, you know, and I guess you already answered that in part in your presentation, how the state-owned enterprises in a way bought off, you know, some of these hybrids and incorporated them. And I think the questions, I mean, will they be able to continue performing, you know? And I think in a let's say a mirror question is, I mean, what are the important institutions doing about it? I mean, they just make their money and left, or they're reinvesting some of the money they made on these sales to state-owned enterprises, you know, and they just move on to other sectors, or they move, you know, up in the value chain in the IC industry, or, I mean, do you have any sense of what are these VCs, you know, these foreign VCs, you know, which you are like behind, you know, these successful hybrids, you know? What's the next play in China if they are pursuing a next play in China? No.
Yeah. Okay.
Just one.
Okay. One more.
I mean, you just pick and choose among those, you know, and then you don't have to answer everything.
I'll try to answer them all, but I just worried I won't remember them all. So.
Yeah, I sent you the question so you can take a look.
Right.
I mean, I think let me just focus on a couple more broad questions, which I think those I'd like for you to hear your opinion about. You know, first, it has the important institutional model work elsewhere, you know, because that's I think is a very strong argument that you have in the book, you know, and you kind of pass through here, you know, and you see like they deliver, you know, these important institutions. I mean, has it worked elsewhere? Because you suggest it was a model that could probably be employed in other countries and perhaps in other industries with very specific, you know, characteristics in terms of modularity in cycles. And of course, you know, in relation to the current pandemic and the state, you know, where there's been a lot of discussion about the state, you know, rolling back in, you know, if there will still be a place for important institution development instruments for emerging countries, you know, because it seems like now we only talk about how the state is back, firmly back in place, and so will this model disappear in a way, or you'll be playing second fiddle to the state again? And the final question, which I think is, in fact, that's your initial proposal for this talk, which I kind of said, well, it's perhaps not so directly related to Brazil. It's if you can comment on the China's counter strategy to American export controls in ICs, which was the subject of one of your recent articles now. So if you can just pick and choose on some of those comments, questions, at your choice.
Well, I'll try to.
And then we move on to open to the public.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to answer them all. I do think this kind of model is one very specific to certain industries. It has to be one of these fragmented value chains that has high value added. So there's both money to be made, and also the investment barriers aren't huge since it's fragmented. And that's also quite fast moving, that helps keep it both fragmented and barriers to entry relatively low, makes incumbents more vulnerable. But so there are only certain industries that would play into this kind of hybrid model where you rely on foreign financing, principally venture capital financing. And that, I guess, segues into a later question. Well, where could this be done? So I think you need the right industry. You also need a lot of human capital in place. And it probably has to be done in a country where the gap between the efficiency of the rest of the economy and doing it this way is quite large. So in China, the state-owned path to doing this was onerously inefficient. So maybe you can imagine another sort of transitional post-planned economy place, such as Vietnam, or just in another place where there's for whatever reason, either there's outright government failure, where they're in certain industrial areas where they can't come up with the investment or such things that this could be applied to. So is this going to be applicable everywhere, or even in a wide swath of places? Probably not. But there are, it was obvious China, like other countries before it used this Rotuni population, used this diaspora. There's a lot of countries that have that. Some of these diaspora are well-trained. So it's not out of the imagination that this could be applied elsewhere. But the flip side of that, of why the domestic firms do so poorly, I think those are a narrower set of firms. I think China's a very interesting case because overall it's done quite well, but it's been kind of a very wasteful model where we don't really see, if we look at exports, they're still very much dominated first by multinationals and then by much more private local firms. And then there's this other sort of asset destroying part of the economy that's still quite large in the state-owned economy. What were some of the other questions? So when I wrote my book, I kind of felt that I laid out sort of 3 scenarios of what would happen with these hybrid firms. The positive scenario where they would, the institutional deficiencies where private firms were discriminated against and SOEs were always supported would diminish. And then you wouldn't need you wouldn't need to turn abroad for financing for promising projects. The other was sort of continuing on the path China was on, where you had this inefficient state sector and still space for these hybrid firms. And then the third scenario, which is I think what we're in, is the state is moving in to very much narrow the space for these hybrid firms, and in essence, killing them off. Okay, and then the issue is, well, will this actually, by taking over these hybrid firms, will it affect their actual performance? And my guess is overall, yes. There may be some exceptions. As I mentioned earlier, that firm Montage, which was taken over by a Shanghai investment fund and then listed in China, they seem to pretty much have let the firm alone to do what it wants. It's a very market-facing firm anyway. So they may be a success story. Other firm, this Unigroup brought up these firms, RDA and Spreadtrum. Okay, they lost the RDA's human capital, but with Spreadtrum, they probably kept a lot of that human capital. But the area it's in, these processors for mobile phones, is very competitive anyway. It's not necessarily that state ownership alone might be at fault, but it doesn't, that firm doesn't look like it's in a very good position. And wise public policy probably would have spent the money spent to acquire that firm doing something else. I'm more worried about SMIC, actually. So they had this sort of established policy of being a fast follower. Now, until they ran into some difficulties with the American government, they had already departed from that and were spending a tremendous and unsustainable amount of money on R&D, which isn't necessarily bad, but it was very clear. Basically, the Chinese government took over this firm and decided, we want to say we have the latest process technology. So they kept pushing SMIC to invest in that, whether or not SMIC had the wherewithal or the absorptive capacity to really do that. So it hadn't been, during this time when it was more effectively under state ownership, it hasn't really been performing that well. It's on sort of an unsustainable path. It would be one thing if there was some light at the end of the tunnel. And I freely admit I may be wrong, but we'll have to see in the next number of years. But so far, it doesn't look like, it looks just like an unsustainable path, not like it's becoming the next TMC. And it's just because the government has decided to do this, irrespective of the market conditions, as it were, or the company's conditions. There's an old story about Intel, which I think sort of helps one think about that. So there was this transition period where Intel still viewed itself as a DRAM memory manufacturer. This is our core identity. This is very, all the engineers running it, this is our core identity. This is very important. At that time, DRAM was at the latest process nodes, so it was seen more advanced. But in reaction to the market, they said, wait a second, more and more of our profits are coming from these CPUs. So gradually over time, in following the market, they became the Intel that became huge and dominant for a number of decades. despite their own internal sort of internalized worship of DRAM technology. So I kind of feel that SMIC is on this technology worship path, but it's not a sustainable one. It'd be as if Intel had kept investing money in DRAM rather than exiting that business and entering the more profitable and ultimately, more an industry with higher technical barriers to entry in CPUs. So I'm quite worried about SMIC. What questions haven't I covered of those?
No, it's okay. Then we can, I just want to make sure that we have time for the other questions. Thanks for
Yeah.
talking. I just have a barrage of questions, and you pick all the ones you're interested most. So that's no big deal. But I want to make sure that we have a space for the other questions here. And then we have...
I see two in the chat.
In the chat, there's Professor Renato Lima de Oliveira from the Asian School of Business in Kuala Lumpur. Then we have a question from Professor Moisés Balestro at the University of Brasília here in Brazil. And a third one from Professor Cristiano Monteiro from the Federal University of Fluminense in Niterói in Rio de Janeiro. So I don't know if Renato, you want to ask a question directly and turn on your camera so I can see you. So it'll be a little bit more engaging for Douglas to see and discuss. Thank you.
Sure. Basically, that's what's there. Is trying to understand what are the industry-specific factors that might make the breakthrough in the semiconductor industry much harder than in other sectors, such as solar panels.
Yeah, I mean, for solar panels, it's a pretty stark difference, even though they both use silicon wafers. Basically, there aren't the technological barriers to making solar panels, particularly the type China makes, are not high. So it's not surprising that China was then awash in solar panels. You don't need the number of skilled engineers you need to run either a logic fab or a memory fab for semiconductors. So in contrast, China tried to do basically the exact same thing in fabrication and ended up with a lot of basically shells of factories because there just wasn't enough skilled manpower to run them. So this is still an industry that demands a lot of engineering resources and specific engineering resources. Even between the logic and memory space, they're different. So it's quite understandable in that regard why they couldn't follow the solar panel model of development. I would add also that some people have heralded China's takeover of the solar panel market as a developmental success, but others have pushed back and said, well, is it really? They even in there, they had huge overcapacity. They could run the solar panel fabs, but they had way too much capacity. So a lot of money was wasted, and because this isn't really an area with high barriers of entry, it doesn't. You want to get into areas which have high rents, and solar panels doesn't seem to be one of them. So a lot of people have said, well, at the end of the day, this isn't really a full success story for China. And yeah, so does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
It's a very interesting thing because if we think that to provide subsidies for the growth of capacity in terms of solar panels is kind of a public good to the rest of the world, in a way, if China is losing money there for the environmental agenda, it's actually a good thing, but that's kind of a separate thing. It might be a bad business decision.
Right.
But,
yeah, no, I mean, I can see the environmental argument, but even not just a bad business decision, but even for China's longer term development, it may turn out to be a drag or just sort of a wash, neither good nor bad. I mean, China is, at worst, sort of a high middle income country now. It has to concentrate more on efficiency of its capital use and what value added it's actually creating, which it could pay less attention to in the past because moving people off the farm and into the factory alone was suddenly a big productivity boost, but it's a little bit more complex now. And even on the environmental side, one little pushback on it you hear from, maybe these were people who are run out of the market, but the argument abroad outside of China is there were next generation solar panels that were going to be much more efficient, yada, 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 cleaner to produce, because the solar panel production itself is kind of an environmental disaster, but and very energy intensive. But we could never go forward with these projects because we were wiped out in this sea of Chinese surplus panels. But I don't have a strong opinion. I don't know the industry well enough to judge either way on that point. So about the state-owned, Moises has, I would like to hear from Douglas whether the spot organization and management.
Moises, you want to pose your question and open your camera so I can see you?
Yes, thank you very much for the talk, Douglas. I think it was, well, I called you Doug. I hope you don't mind.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, because Antonio calls you that way. So my question is, to what extent do you think that there were, or could you really identify differences in terms of technological or organizational capabilities between the state-owned firms and the hybrid firms? And why do you think, or what is the reason? I assume that commercial market demand tends to be more sophisticated than state procurement for this industry, or at least more, I don't know, maybe broader. And so that is my question on the supply side and on the demand side, commercial versus state procurement.
Okay. I mean, I think, speaking of, I mean, there are more universal arguments people make about state ownership, that of which there are also negative arguments, of which there's also a lot of exceptions to. But I think for China, its specific case, there are these problems of not only are these firms often run by people who then will go on to do something in the bureaucracy, so they're not necessarily ever run from a commercial point of view, and they're given all these other missions by the state that have nothing to do with being a viable commercial enterprise. But there's also, the background is just this finance SOE nexus, where the state-owned banks understand it's safest to lend to the SOEs, even ones that are insolvent, because those are the firms most likely to be bailed out by the state. And this is yet really to be broken or changed. So there's this underlying issue of the soft budget constraint and the knowledge that working at an SOE is incredibly safe thing to do. And I mean, what I showed in my work is in actual outcomes, it did matter. They tended not to be able to catch up technologically, produce the goods, do certain technological activities across many parts of the IT industry, as well as these other counterpart firms. And in terms of procurement in China, I mean, I can see in other countries where state procurement might be more demanding, right? That the defense industry might have extremely demanding specifications. Some of those specifications might not be helpful in the long term for commercial applications, but nevertheless would be quite demanding. I think the issue for China is they've often tried, because the state is so pervasive, the state is often involved in what otherwise would be commercial marketplaces, not military or other government ones, and yet the state's still there making the decisions, and they keep going back to the same firms. I didn't heard private firms in China tell me they tried to sell into these for certain types of goods, for like IC cards and the like, tried to sell into these government operations, but it was well nigh impossible, or they wanted, bribes, which then made it, extremely unattractive. But basically, there's this hierarchy of preference, and the state-owned firms are at the front of the line, and these other firms just don't get in on all, and so they're sort of, some of them forced then to try to find other resources. I mean, for design in China, I think one thing that helped them is just the sheer growing size of demand within China from these enormous export platforms, that more and more chips were needed. This link to a nearby market was useful for that industry's development. In contrast, for a place such as India, where I've looked at the IC design sector, where they have very sophisticated designs, but they don't really have much of a sales presence, because India just doesn't really have this large export-oriented electronics sector yet. I think this also goes back a bit to a question of Antonio's I forgot to answer, which was about, well, where's military procurement in this? And I think in the initial years, these were quite separate. There are these military R&D centers and military companies providing the military equipment, and okay, they might have consumed some commercially available ICs as well, but it wasn't, with one or two exceptions like that firm Huawei, they weren't really, the two sides were pretty separate. I think it was only when the Chinese government started to emphasize civil military fusion that you got more of an interest in using these developing commercial operations, in part because they were more advanced. So that's why SMIC got in trouble. They started helping out people at the National defense technology university to research on chips. This is, of course, also when they were more, SMIC was more state controlled. But this has been overall pretty marginal to the development of these firms, probably because a lot of what the military procurement needs is not actually are small numbers of very specific chips that aren't going to help these commercial vendors. I mean, it's kind of a very different situation than in the 1960s when this industry was just starting out, and there really wasn't too much of a commercial marketplace. Then military procurement was very important for Intel. I mean, there was a marketplace in IBM, but of course, IBM was doing most of that internally. Now it's possibly everyone's lying to me, but I really have seen very little switch over from the mysterious defense operations and R&D centers in places like Nanjing, and then the commercial side. The vast majority of successful, let's say, chip designers in China were trained outside of China and typically spent a fair amount of time outside and then went back. Maybe the latest generation within Huawei, but then they were in this big, quite sophisticated design outfit that was designing for a broad array of commercial facing applications. So I see them pretty much developing on relatively separate paths.
Well, thanks, Douglas. Thanks, Moisés, for the question. I think we have one final question.
Thank you very much.
From Cristiano, Professor Cristiano Monteiro from the Federal University. Cristiano, you have the floor.
Okay, hi, Antonio. Hi, everybody. Hello, Douglas. Very nice presentation. Thank you. I think you mostly answered my question when you answered Renato's one. But anyway, my curiosity is about possible generalizations from your results, considering not only the industry that you're studying, but the idea of state-led development in general, or maybe China's model. My question is if it's something related to the characteristics of the technology, or maybe a broader situation in terms of the society, economy, and all that have changed, and then what worked before is not going to work as well now. So what would you say about that?
Yeah.
In terms of the institutional character of the development strategy.
Right. Well, I mean, I think for China, it's both. It hasn't worked well for this industry, but I think there's, and I'm happy to report, I think there are more and more people sort of in my camp, people sort of bemoaning the lack of institutional development and change in China. So, in defense of China, they have managed to marshal lots of investment and invest a lot. But as I said, it hasn't always been wisely. They haven't, I mean, it's striking if you think about where China is today, that it's this enormous country with thousands upon thousands of firms. And if we're going to say, and it's invested, put a priority on technological development, what really impressive technology firm does it have? It basically has one, Huawei. I mean, at a similar stage, you would probably say Korea had several of these, and it's a much smaller country. So I think this continued discrimination against the private sector has hurt China, and that goes across sectors. I mean, the work of Lauren Brandt and Eric Toon, and much more sort of mature, what they call, I think, middle tech machinery sectors, where they show that the more diverse the competition the Chinese government allows, the better off, the more developed that sector is. That shows it too, that the sectors where they've really too much emphasized state-owned firms, even in non-tech high-tech sectors, it's hurt them. And so, I mean, I would say from the end of, so let's say post Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji era. So from 2002, 2003 onward, there was sort of, in many ways, stasis in how the society, distributed resources, even though there was always talk about change. In many ways, it did not change for the better. And then in some ways now, it may be getting a little bit worse, as you see with the moves against large, so Alibaba was another one of these hybrid firms, essentially. And now there's all these, moves against that firm and these other firms where the CEOs were maybe not as daring as Jack Ma, are falling into line. So there seems to even be maybe backward movement in terms of institutional development in China. Now, I'm not going to say that, all areas, there was sort of stasis from 2002, 2003 onward. Antonio also asked, and again, I forgot to respond, about venture capital. There, I think there's a complex picture. There were more and more local venture capital units coming up. There was also state policies to encourage venture capital, which was sort of both good and bad. Maybe there was too much of venture capital or in the wrong vehicles, but it wasn't solely necessary to rely on foreign venture capital anymore. So that was an area of improvement. But now, I think the space for operation, once you get significantly large in China, is becoming worrisomely small. On one final note about the war on Huawei and China's response. So the US government is trying to use these EDA tools and capital equipment to sort of cut off Huawei from being able to design its chips and then to find people to fabricate the chips for them. But China's far behind in its EDA tool industry and also in capital equipment. I think the problem now is that if Trump had stayed in power, there was at least a chance that the US would pursue a very broad strategy of trying to cut off a wide swath of technology to a wide swath of Chinese firms. Now I see it pretty much as relatively narrow. So it's affected Huawei, and those probably won't be fully rolled back, even though, frankly, the Secretary of Commerce of the US is pretty pro Huawei for someone in Washington, D.C. But I don't see them. So the Republicans keep pushing for, let's just try to cut them off from all technology below 45 nanometers or 14 nanometers using a certain process node of technology. But I don't see the Biden administration willing to do that. If they did that, then a lot of US allies would have to think twice. Well, would we want to cooperate with the US, or do we want to develop alternative channels to serve China, and they might just choose to serve China. But if it's narrowly targeted, you know, you lose the Huawei business if you're TSMC, but whoever is selling the telecommunication infrastructure equipment needs chips. So, okay, TSMC will be making chips for Ericsson or Samsung or whomever. So it's a lot more palatable for them. And even the sanctions on SMIC are extremely targeted. They're very narrow. They're actually sanctioning them, not providing them technology for fabrication. SMIC can't even do yet anyway. So it's a direct response that SMIC was sort of caught doing things it said it wasn't doing in terms of helping with defense R&D and interacting with the military procurement. As you know, it was part of this vetted vendors program that it could buy US equipment because it promised not to serve the Chinese military, and then it engaged in these things. So, you know, under whatever administration that would have happened. But I kind of see this as sort of in stasis right now. I don't think it's going to expand to any more larger players in China. But I also think that makes it quite hard for China to find allies, whether American firms or other foreign firms, to sort of work with it to circumvent US sanctions. Since, you know, this is a Huawei problem, not a Baidu problem or Alibaba problem, or problems for other firms that have the potential for being big designers and consumers of chips in China.
Okay, wow, Douglas, thanks 1,000 for your fantastic talk and very engaging discussions. I think the questions are very good for the audience, and in the discussion, I think we cover a lot of ground, to say the least. And I think for me it was very enlightening. I think for all of us, it really gave us, a magnificent overview of the evolution of the current issues of the IC industry, both globally and in China, as well as the trade and strategic issues related to this industry, in the contemporary debates, and also, of course, from a comparative political economy perspective, what are the lessons and the pitfalls that you can have, from this Chinese experience in ICs with the hybrids and using foreign institutions. And I think it was a magnificent, the level and the scope and the depth of the discussion we had here, and I think will make all of us think, for a long time. So I really like to thank you for that. And unless we're already 10 minutes over time, unless someone has a very pressing question or a last minute question that you have to ask Douglas, I'd like to thank everyone. Just give me 1 minute, see if someone has a very pressing question, otherwise you'll part ways. Anyone has a pressing question?
It's just a practical question. These results are not in your book from 2016. They are more recent, aren't they? The results you presented here. It's not in your book, yes. Hidden Tiger, Paper Tigers.
Well, the book goes up to about 2014-15. So yeah, but so I have a 2019 chapter in a Cambridge edited volume that takes it up to about 2018. And then these two papers, one from the Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Lab, and then this paper I wrote for something called the China Leadership Monitor. Those take it up to 2021. So
okay,
if you can contact me, I'd be happy to send those to you.
Great.
So yeah, okay.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your participation, and especially thanks to Douglas the talk, and I hope we can continually engage, and hopefully, once the pandemic is over, you'll be able to bring it to Rio or to Brazil overall,
Okay.
so we can be here and engage with us on a personal basis now. So thanks 1,000 for your kindness and your overture to do this, being very late in Hong Kong, so you're probably a bit tired by now, so I don't want to impose more on you than you already did, and apologize for my wide range, barrage of questions.
No. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks 1,000 for everyone, and thanks everyone for the
Thank you.
participation.
Thank you all.
And
Thank
everyone
you.
who participated here and attended. Thanks a lot.
All right.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you, Hockey.